Morning, everyone. Welcome back to another HL7AU Patient Summary FHIR IG call. I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of country, and we acknowledge the traditional owners of the custodians, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We acknowledge the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators, and healers. In today's agenda, we'll go through the usual business first, approval of minutes, updates and news, and also there's some reporting on actions out of previous minutes. We were going to do the example use case decisions first today, but I've been asked to move that to the end due to a time conflict. So we'll swap that around and start with the walkthrough of profiles first, and then make sure we leave enough time at the end to go through the example use case decisions. And what we're looking at today is that walkthrough of profiles, looking for gremlins, looking for feedback, and also building out more of the example use case information. So just reminded everybody the schedule. We're working towards putting out a ballot for comment, which is an early draft to get wider community feedback on the work that we've done. We've gone through a few profile walkthroughs and we're back to that today. We've got one more that we want to go through before we're going to take that draft to the Sparked testing event and do some combined testing with AU Core, with e-requesting, and then bring back any of the feedback or I guess topics that we might want to work through that have come out of that testing event into our next series of meetings before we put out a draft for the ballot for comment. So let's go through our usual business. As always, we start with approval of minutes. I'll just go to those. Those were sent out for review last week. So we can see these here as we go through. We've got the agenda, we've got the participants, there's the slides and recording, we've got a series of minutes and decisions, and also a series of actions are here. Does anyone need more time to review those before we look to approve them? I'm not hearing anyone or seeing any hands up. So who would like to motion for approval of the minutes of the last meeting?
I can do that, Ricardo.
Thanks, Ricardo. Who would like to second that?
I can second, Landon Riley.
Thanks, Landon. Okay, I'll now launch the poll. You should see that pop up for approval of minutes of the previous meeting. Please vote affirmative, negative, or abstain. And if you don't have access to the vote, please pop your vote in the chat. And if you've dialed in, you can say your name and what your vote is. Okay, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll end that poll. So with the vote in the chat, that is 11 affirmative, 0 negative, 11 abstain. The motion carries. Those minutes are approved. Okay. Now let's go back. So there's 2 actions from not last meeting, but the meeting before that were raised out of one of the profile walkthroughs, in particular around patient, that were that have now been completed. And there was a concern raised by Stephen on the cardinality of patient gender being 1-to-1 and its relationship with gender identity, and a concern that having patient.gender, that is the administrative value as unknown, might conflict with and cause problems with systems if you had a value for gender identity. That was brought to the last FHIR work group, the Australian FHIR work group, where it was discussed, and the Australian FHIR work group came to the position that is reasonable, that it is acceptable for a system to have a value of unknown for administrative gender, and that gender identity may be known in that circumstance, and that there was guidance in AU base on how to address that. Subsequently, we've had advice that the issue that had been raised on AU Core about relaxing patient.gender for that reason is should now be closed, and that won't be progressed. So those actions are now done. Out of the last meeting, there were a number of actions for Heath, who is working through those. And there's some comments at the bottom of these minutes if you're interested to look at that while that's being progressed. And we'll report back on the actions in particular in our next meeting. What I really wanted to move on to was some of the report back from the HL7 International meeting in May in Madrid. I'm really only going to call out a couple of points because we don't have a lot of time in this meeting, some of which we're going to talk in more detail later. A number of Australians were there. That includes, Ruben and Graham and David Rowlands, the chair, Stephen Chu from the agency. I went, Vince McCauley. There are some other people whose names I'm forgetting. And in particular, I went into the IPS track at the Connectathon to bring some of the Australian patient summary examples and feedback we'd had. That was really good. We confirmed that we can exchange AU patient summary FHIR documents with a number of the US vendors who were there testing, and also looked at that with New Zealand and had a look at some of the standard IPS viewers. We identified some display issues. For some reason, and this wasn't specific to Australia, the IPS viewer from Washington State was not displaying dosage.txt. So that was being looked through. And we discussed some of the things around referencing approaches, which I'll talk to you guys about in a later meeting. And in particular, we looked through and addressed some of the feedback that had come from a number of Australians on IPS around conformance requirements and obligation and terminology that will be discussed in our conformance sessions next week and in the later ones. And then we'll come back to this group when there's a proposal there. I do want to call out there is some work that's going on in the background. So it's not available right now. Graham is working on multi-IG inheritance in IG Publisher. So that's where you can identify more than one base that you want to derive from, is working through how to make that happen. And that would open up another pathway for the Australian Patient Summary IG to identify both core and IPS as its two bases and work from there. So I'm keeping track of that, and I encourage other people who are interested to be part of that conversation. Your best bet is to go to Zulip and start looking through the tooling channel. There's also work being done on the templates for FHIR IGs to ensure that there's an obligation view tab, how there's a diff tab and a snapshot tab. There's looking to be an obligation view tab so that some of the obligations are moved out of the other views, because there's been feedback that having the obligations in there is just too busy for implementers, and they only want to see that at certain different times. There's also just some discussion on IG Council policy, which is very, very relevant to us. So there's discussions going on at the HL7 IG Council on jurisdictional patient summaries. There's a lot of work being done by other nations, obviously including Australia, to express how patient summaries conformant to IPS, or sometimes maybe not conformant to IPS, work in their jurisdiction. And so there's discussion on developing a policy that jurisdictional patient summaries will need to clarify whether or not they're based on the IPS. And if they are, and we are, then we need to, in our IG, make it clear that they are proper IPSs, as in they validate against IPS, which works for us because we've made a policy that we will be compliant to both IPS and core, and that we should reference a section that describes any limitations of receiving an IPS document that doesn't conform to our national expectations. As in, what happens if we get one in Australia that is actually developed from New Zealand or from Europe, and identify what any potential problems there might be. So I think that's a future sort of candidate for our connectathons going forwards, and some of our testing events to start to bring in, for those people who are interested in building in a capability or testing out what happens if you get something from another jurisdiction. I think that's a candidate for us to explore. I'm going to come back to this in future calls, basically, but I wanted to highlight that this was part of the discussion at the last HL7 International. And I think Jushi's popped in a link into the chat for where this discussion is happening on Zulip. And as updates happen, we'll come back to you. Any sort of questions on that update from HL7 International? And Ruben, is there anything else that you wanted to state about what happened in the work group?
I think you covered it pretty well there, Danielle. Yeah, I mean, something which I'm not sure I've mentioned on these calls before is there is also a group that's made up of all the standards development organizations that have contributed anything to IPS. And that includes SNOMED and HL7, of course. They're part of a group called the IPS Coordination Committee. A number of their members were there, including myself. I represent HL7 International on that committee. And work continues. It's sort of been paused whilst we have all these international SDO meetings, but those meetings of the coordination committee will resume the week after Dev Days. And we've got a growing sort of pipeline of requests there, including things like terminology coordination for the value sets in IPS. So yeah, lots going on, and I thought Madrid was a great meeting. It's especially encouraging to see that there is some level of compatibility and interoperability between what we're doing here and what's happening in the US and other nations. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruben. All right, now I'm going to skip past this because we agreed to move it to the end. Let's go through profile walkthroughs. We've gotten through these 7 so far. Slight change of the order for today is to go through the other required ones: allergy intolerance, organization, practitioner role, and then move on to procedure and encounter, which are more optional. And see if we get through those today. And if not, we'll have to move them to not next meeting, but the one after, because I think it's really important we have a look at the composition and bundle before we go into the Spark testing event. So quick reminder, our design principles, we are expecting to validate against both IPS and AU Core when they're available. When it's just IPS, it should validate against IPS. When there's only an AU Core profile, it should validate against AU Core. That means we're also validating our references against Patient Summary, and the AU Core profile value sets are preferred over IPS. We're defined, noting, of course, if there's overlapping and it's required, then we have to have the intersection of those to conform to both IPS and AU Core. And so we look at the binding strength for that. And what we're going through is a draft set of profiles that put all these rules together, fully calculated in the diff. And then once we've looked through these and confirmed what it is through these reviews, we're then moving to change that pattern so that instead of manually doing that, we actually derive from AU Core. So we pick that up. Sanjeev.
Daniel, I have a question about the previous slide.
Yes.
shall validate against both IPS and AU core profiles. Now,
Yes.
AU core profiles, does it mean we need to be compliant with AU core profiles?
Yes.
And okay, maybe I'm confused. I thought maybe 5 or 6 months back that was not the case. Has it changed?
No, that is the case. We've got a decision log which says that our AU patient summary shall be compliant with AU core and IPS.
This was presented in December at the workshop and was agreed.
Okay.
Yep.
So we need to confirm it with the AU core first to be conformant with AUPS. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Profiles, not requester responder. It's not
No,
about the
I'm talking
capability
profile.
statements, but the
Profile.
profile, yes. Yep. Alrighty, so let's start with allergy intolerance. So this is one of those ones where there's quite a few IPS type conventions that come in. If we implement AU core allergy intolerance, so we're compliant to AU core allergy intolerance, are there additional requirements? And yes, there are. You guys who have been in the previous walkthrough should be kind of familiar now with the fact that IPS has a convention that has the reference sub-element for patients mandatory. I'll show you that in a second. There's a new element of must support. So allergy intolerance.type is flagged as must support in IPS. It's not in AU core. And there is the IPS data type of codable concept IPS, which puts sub-elements like coding and text are flagged as must support. And the last one isn't actually an impact to us from the data only perspective. So I just wanted to call out, although there's a must support, and I'll get to it when I walk through the profile, that's more of coming into the conformance obligations area rather than the flat data requirements. So let's go now to the profile. If you have questions, pop your hand up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you in our experimental area. Oh, and I just clicked on something. Sorry. And then this is AU cause allergy intolerance, which hopefully people are familiar. If we look at the allergy intolerance from AU core, which derives from base and has a whole series of must supports on it. And then we have IPS, and their allergy intolerance has a whole series of must supports, not exactly the same, but very overlapping, and obligations in it. And we have terminology in both. So if we put all of these rules together, this is what it looks like. I'll have to flick between these two profiles if you want to see all the value sets, but we'll just start from the top. So clinical status and verification status are marked as must support, and that comes in from AU core. There's no proposed change in terminology to FHIR. So that's just the standard FHIR required binding, which for clinical status is active, inactive, and resolved. And for verification status, that's these values: unconfirmed, confirmed, refuted, and entered in error. So the difference here is the must support. Then we have type, and the element of type has must support, and that comes in from IPS. And that is again a required binding. This is a code data type. And you can supply either allergy or intolerance. Or of course, if you don't know it, it's optional. You can not provide it. But if you have received it, well, now we're getting into obligations and conformance. But yeah. In terms of code, we have the same rules coming in from AU core. So code is mandatory. That is also the same in IPS. It's mandatory. The binding is the extensible binding that is inherited from AU core. That is aligned to AU CDI. and the requirements both for the core data case and the patient summary use case. And we have a additional binding, which is a candidate binding that again comes in from core. And that's a more specific list, which is why it's not here in extensible. When it comes to patient, this is mandatory. That's a FHIR rule. We say you need to conform to the AU patient summary patient profile, which itself demonstrates conformance to both IPS and core together. So that's why that reference is there. And then here's that rule I was showing from IPS, where instead of just saying reference, and it's up to you how you do that, whether you do that with an identifier or a display or a type or a combination, there's now an additional constraint, and that comes in from IPS. And that says here, you need to provide the reference subtype. And that is mandated. Then on the next set of elements, we have onset. So onset must support both, I think, from IPS and core. Let me just refresh that. So this is IPS. Let's just double check. Yes, good. It's in both. Okay. And IPS is placing must support on date time. They're placing an obligation of should able to. So that doesn't affect necessarily the wire, but it is a recommendation to producers of IPS documents that you should be capable of doing date time and not just these others. Talk through that kind of thing in much more detail on the conformance proposals that are in, not next week, I think, but it's the week after is when we're going to come back and start to go through obligations and what does it mean for producers and consumers of patient summary documents. Next one, must support reaction. That comes from IPS and AU core. That's optional. You can have multiple. We come down to manifestation and severity. Both have must support. The terminology here is the manifestation from Australia. So that's an NCTS reference set. If I just come down to key elements that we inherit from AU base here, which is currently clinical finding. There is a change request on this that will affect this specification that is being considered, where there is a specific reference set for manifestation that is the Australian Clinical Reference Set, and it's also one called out in AU CDI, and there's a change request on AU base, which would filter through core and then up into AU patient summary to say that the preferred set really should be that manifestation set, which is what's also defined in AU CDI. So that is something that is being considered at, I think, the next FHIR work group meeting, which is next Wednesday, if you're interested to come along. And the last one is severity. Now that binding there comes from FHIR. There's no change to that either in IPS or AU core. That's a FHIR binding, which for your interest is this one. So you can say severity of mild, moderate, and severe. And that's all you can say because it's a required binding. So you have to provide one of these if you're going to say something about severity. And that's allergy intolerance. My question here is, are any of those of concern to people? So we haven't talked a lot about allergy intolerance type, for example, in the past. I think everything else has pretty much been discussed in various AU core TDGs before. Are there any concerns with this, or should we just move on to the next profile? All right, one last question. Are we missing anything? Is there something here that we haven't yet discussed through AU core TDGs that you think is actually critical for inclusion? Okay. Oh, and I forgot, as of yesterday, the AU core TDG voted that a minimum requirement for use cases in Australia is allergy intolerance note, which is an AU-CDI element for core and patient summary. So that will come in. Yoni.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, just a quick question. On the allergy section, do we have any emergency management plans that we could potentially upload or consider uploading?
So at the composition level, I think that's where we want to talk through that. So that's next week, where we talk about how do we go beyond just a specific resource type, and then we'll go into sections next week. Oh, sorry, next fortnight. Apologies.
Thank you.
David?
Yeah, hi, good morning. I'm just wondering, is it possible to show, or do we need to show allergy intolerances that could be related to each other? Can we do that?
In what way? What
I'm allergic to this, and because I'm allergic to this, if I'm also allergic to that, and if I get them together, oh boy, something like
as
that.
a minimum requirement or as guidance?
How would you represent that, I suppose? Like, could you represent that one allergy intolerance could affect another allergy intolerance?
Could I add to that? Sorry, like for example, in Parkinson's disease, and there's certain medications that they shouldn't be having, like certain antiemetics. So that would be potentially a good example.
So in that case, with a contraindication, you don't pop that in allergy intolerance, because that would be associated with flag and adverse event, where you're saying that because of this particular condition, like it's not specific to the individual, allergy intolerance resources are really meant to be about a specific individual's propensity rather than contraindication against diseases or combinations of medications you shouldn't have.
Okay, thanks.
And I don't see any way to do it within the allergy intolerance. So if it may be more represented more like a condition if there is that level of criticality.
Yeah, other things could point to and join things together, and I think we're now going up to grouper kind of combos.
Sure. Yeah, I guess we need to just you'd have to have a good example, I suppose.
Yeah, and there's no reason for or anything like that, whereas condition has reasons for where you get to be able to link things together, whereas there's nothing in the allergy intolerance. So if there was a clinical use case, that would have to ripple up to the patient care committee in the US.
Good. Cheers.
Which we absolutely could explore. I think it's a bit beyond the specifics of a minimum set of requirements around patient summary, but I think it's an interesting use case, and I think that one in particular, because of its nature, should actually be surfaced through the clinical design group, which should then provide advice to us, rather than, I think that would be much better than us trying to consider that in isolation. But I would like to see that as a candidate. So David, you could provide that into the backlog for the clinical design group set of considerations.
Radio.
All right, let's go to the next one. So that was allergy intolerance. Just closing all of that down. Let's go to, my slides will tell me what our next one is. Where am I even going? Because we're out of order. Aha! This one's nice and easy. Organization. So there's an organization resource. It's used in things like the composition, where you have a custodian of the composition. It's used in all sorts of other places where you can reference a participant or who has asked for something or done something or is related to something. And if you implement AU Core, there are no additional requirements. So the AU Core profile for organization is fully sufficient to meet the rules. So if we go have a look at organization, down to organization, and this is IPS's organization floating around somewhere. Where did you go? There. And this is AU Cause organization. All right, we'll start with core. So AU Cause organization says identifiers are mandatory. Well, sorry, identifiers are must support. They are not mandatory. And we say you need to support HPIOs and ABNs. Type of organization is must support. Name is mandatory. We made that change in AU Core. And telecom and address are must support. That's what AU Core does. And the terminology for type comes from AU Base and was worked through as part of that PCA project with the Digital Health Agency to describe through SNOMED a set of types of healthcare organisation roles. And that's set at a preferred binding. And if we look at IPS's, and I'll go to the differential view, IPS's rules are really, really light. They say you also need to have a name. So both core and IPS say name's mandatory. And they also put must support on telecom and address. So you can see that IPS basically has a subset of the AU core requirements. So when we come along to the AU Patient Summary organization, it basically looks like the AU core rules. That's what it looks like. So if you've implemented the AU core organization, that is at this point sufficient. The question then comes to you guys, in a patient summary context, is that sufficient? Is there anything here that would cause you problems and we should probably feed back to core? Or are there things where you think that in a patient summary context, maybe we need different or other or more information? Just leave that open briefly, and if not, we can move on. All right, nothing's coming now, but we can discover that as we go through some of the more use case discussions and some of the connectathon testing later. So let's go from past organization and on to the next one, which is practitioner, I believe. Here we go. So practitioner, if we start with AU core and oh, that says allergy intolerance. Whoops. Other additional requirements? Yes, IPS has flagged 2 additional elements with must support. These were originally in AU core and we removed them. We removed must support on them. And they are deemed through IPS that in a patient summary context, these 2 are important. So let's have a look at that. This is AU Core's practitioner, which again, we say identifiers must support. And in this case, we just call out a HPII. We say you need to have a name. Name is mandatory. And in that circumstance, in every time you give us a name for a practitioner, family has to be supplied. And you might also supply a given. That's also must support. So that's it. AU Core's practitioner is very light compared to other profiles, including US core and IPS. We discussed that at the time, and this was intentional. And the reason for that is that in Australia, we tend to make much more use of practitioner role, which is where we see those contact details where we actually put must support on instead of devolving them to the practitioner. And the reason we do that is because we're trying to say that their contact details are specific to the person in this role, because a practitioner might be at multiple offices doing multiple different roles, and the contact details are likely to be different. And so we're associating them with the role. So if we look at IPS practitioner, I'll go to differential table. This is what they have. So they're also saying name, you have to have one. In their circumstance, although they put must support on family and given, they don't mandate family, whereas we have. And they have telecom and address. So you can see they don't have identifier, but they have telecom and address. And that makes sense for their circumstance because they're looking a lot at cross-border. So if we come to what all of that looks like together in the Australian patient summary, compliant to IPS and core, it looks like this. We're saying you need to provide support for identifiers, in particular HPII. You need to provide support and provide at least one name with a family name. And you need to provide support for telecom and address. So that's what that looks like. Are there any comments or concerns about this one? Is that what people were expecting? Seems like everyone's all right with it.
I'm all right with it, Danielle, but I did have a question for you, and
Yeah.
apologies if this has been covered off in a prior meeting of this group. But I note that the sort of primary parent profile for this profile is AU base practitioner, and then we
Yes.
say it also complies with AU core practitioner. I was just wondering why we didn't just make AU core practitioner the primary parent profile, because it itself is a sort of child of AU base practitioner.
We will do that later this afternoon.
Okay,
So
no worries.
the current view is to allow us in our human walkthrough to see everything all at once, all the must supports in one view. And then after we've done the walkthroughs, we will move to derive from AU core.
Thank you.
No worries, which is normatively equivalent. It's just a different view so that you can see I guess the way we're framing it on the slides, that if you've implemented AU core, what are your additional is what you will see in that diff view.
I guess it's kind of interesting for human. They're saying for name, you're going to give me a human name. And if it's like, I just call him doctor.
If you just call them doctor, then you aren't meeting the requirements, which makes sense for a patient summary.
But I'm sorry, I'm just a patient telling you who is my practitioner.
But I don't think that's that. I think that's probably a good case to declare why we've put those rules in. That's not sufficient to actually identify a practitioner.
No, but I guess that's right. No, so we would only ever use a practitioner name, human name, when we had it. That's right.
Yeah, when you've got something. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we ask a patient, we're trying to collect who was the practitioner, and all we can collect is just text. We can't be for sure if they're saying just doctor.
There are other ways around this in referencing. So just quick divergence. This is being referenced by, okay, let's go medication request, just quickly. There's a reference data type here. Unlike this one, with a reference data type that says you have to give us a specific reference, the reference data type allows you to just supply a text alternative.
Danielle, you know your stuff here. My goodness, well done. Yeah.
So while we don't allow that in patient summary, we say you always have to have a patient resolvable resource, right? Because that's really important. For the other things like practitioner, where you can't meet the rules of the resolve thing, you can supply, oops, I went too far. You can supply a different way of doing this. At the moment, we may move to close that up. We may say we may actually find that problematic for interoperability to allow this, or it might turn out to be a meaningful, usable way to do it in Australia. We need to look at that.
No, it's usually a good catch-all anyway, just to make sure you don't miss anything.
Yeah.
Good, thanks.
All right, so that's practitioner. Let's go to practitioner role. This one is. And AU core practitioner role. Okay. So there is one difference, one additional requirement for IPS. Sorry, there's other differences. But if you implement practitioner role, then the difference to be aware of course, is that IPS has a data type for codable concept. And so that impacts the fact that of practitionerrole.code, which is a codable concept. So that's the only additional requirement imposed by IPS. So if we look at AU core practitioner role, which is our strong basis, because this was built around practitioner roles in Australia to support all use cases. We've got support here for identifier. Again, it's not mandatory. We have called out explicit support for Medicare provider number here because provider numbers are about practitioners in a role rather than HPIIs, which are back on the practitioner resource because they're associated with an individual practitioner and don't change when they move roles. We've said you shall have a reference software practitioner. Noting again that reference point here, right, David, you don't have to actually have the full resource. You can have that display reference if you need to.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
We've got support for organization, but it's still optional. So we can say the role is known by this identifier. Here's who they are specifically, like their name or other identifying details. Here's where that role is. And then we've got things like code and specialty. They're both must support. So you can say what specific roles and specific specialties are associated with this role. And here we've got those telecom details. That's where we're putting them. Whereas address would be associated with the organization. If we look at IPS, they're really light because again, you see that real difference with how Australia set things out with the early provider directory work and PCA. And they've only got must support on organization. They do put a codable concept data type here, and they have an IPS level set of codes, which is an ISO standard, whereas the Australian one that we're using, which comes in from base, was built out of the work with provider directory and PCA and is Australian. So I'll just come to, it's in AU core as well. We go look at that. Both the specialty and the code terminologies are the reference sets defined through NCTS and through the agency. So they're the ones we're going to carry into AU patient summary because it's within an Australian context. So if we go look at all of that together, I'll just close down this reference thing. This is what this looks like. All of that together looks like support for identifiers, Medicare provider. Please provide us with a practitioner, which conforms to that practitioner profile I just ran through. Please provide, well, you can provide organization. We need support for it, which conforms to that organization profile I just ran through. Support for the code with codable concept IPS, which is the terminology from AU core. So it's that NCTS, Australian reference set for practitioner roles, and the NCTS for clinical specialties in Australia. And then we've got the telecom here. I will pose a question, and that is codable concept. Now, the IPS profile doesn't provide support for specialty, and we do. And I think we need to consider, like we did last meeting, applying the IPS profiling rules to apply this codable concept IPS data type to this element, so that we're consistent with the expectations of patient summaries. That's my thought on, I think, an extra step we should be taking. But I'll open that up to comment. Are there any other questions, comments, and also how do people feel about moving that to be a codable concept IPS data type?
Well, my only comment is what happens with AU core derived elements. We can't make them IPS compliant. Sorry?
You don't need to.
Yeah.
AU core is more generic, and this is the derived use case, which overwrites it and has a constrained data type.
Okay.
Brett?
Could we just eyeball the codable concept IPS, please? So it's not a lot to ask, I think.
There are
Need to have a
obligations.
text- Need
I
to have
think we
text
need to
or
argue.
a code. Yeah.
Yeah, so the cardinality doesn't change. The obligations do.
Yeah. Kind of just make sure it's populated with something.
Yeah, so, and I don't want to get into too much detail about obligations, we will, but how you would read this is specialty is optional, or we can say code, either way. Code is optional, but if you supply it according to IPS, then if you know the text, you shall populate. If you have the coding, like the actual code, you shall populate it. And if you go into coding IPS, that continues applying must support on these things in particular. So supply the display if you know it. I don't actually agree with this, but that's for me to argue back with IPS. I don't think it's great practice to always supply display, but whatever. And shall populate code and system if you know them. So that's the obligations there. They've also explicitly modeled translation, because again, it's an IPS, but that it doesn't require support for that extension. So that's what we'd be bringing in, so that we treat them consistent. But if there's concerns, we can hold off on that.
I actually think that's a good move. It keeps it all in line, and I don't think it's very onerous.
Does anyone have any concerns about applying the codable concept IPS data type there? Landon?
I have no concerns. All that seems fine, but I also share that concern around that display being must support. For our system, for example, the display name might not be the official SOMED code and it may flag different issues.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Landon. That's a real problem.
It's a problem. It's going to fail, like any sort of some validation if you.
It will actually.
I think in some ways too, you could say you don't actually have it, so you don't need to supply it. So you would have to suppress it if it's not a valid code. And you
would have to.
I mean, you shouldn't really populate it if it's not valid.
Yes.
That's the short answer. Yeah.
That's what we'd have to do. But anyway, the rest is fine. Thanks.
It also worries me, display, I know we've only got a few minutes left on this topic. Display worries me because it is different in different jurisdictions. And so one display that validates in Australia, if it's a SNOMED CTAU concept, won't validate somewhere else necessarily. And so I think we've had that problem with ENAU and EN recently that let's take an action to delve more into the codable concept IPS thing here in the conformance sessions and provide some feedback back to IPS on this display shall populate if known, and see if we can get that turned to maybe a should. All right, so I'm chair, so I can't motion, but if we would like to move to change this to codable concept IPS, because the concern we've raised seems to be actually across everywhere it is, not specific to specialty, then would someone like to motion that practitioner role specialty has the codable concept IPS data type applied?
I'm happy to motion that, Landon Riley.
Thanks, Landon. Who would like to second that?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Okay, David seconding. Any other comments or questions while I move to find the electronic poll? All right, I've launched that vote for the current motion, which is making practitioner role specialty codable concept IPS being consistent with all the other must support elements of type codable concept. And if you can't vote using the poll because you can't see it, then please put it in the chat. And if you've dialed in, you can just say your name and whether you are affirmative, negative, or abstain. And I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll and share the results. So with the vote in the chat, we have 17 affirmative, 0 negative, 7 abstain. And we also have a action in the minutes to consider the obligations on coding.display and provide feedback back to the IPS project group. Okay, so we're almost actually at time. We've done the mandatory ones that I wanted to get through today, coming back to this list. We haven't yet done procedure and encounter, and I don't think we have time in 5 minutes to whip through those. So what I'm proposing now is we hold those over and we move to the use case discussions. Are there any objections to that? Hearing none, I will stop sharing and I will hand that over to Steve or Shelley to go through.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. I will just try and figure out the share. Okie dokie. Actually, can I trouble you to share and we'll go through. I have trouble on this computer with sharing into the Zoom.
Right, let me bring it back up. Okay, everyone, can you see that?
Yep. Thanks. Okie dokie. Okay, so thanks. So we've just been working through the use cases and getting some design decisions over the past few meetings. One thing that we just want to highlight is that the use cases we're presenting here are just examples. They're not going to be mandates. So whatever we come up with, we'll just end up as examples. There's no guidelines or anything that will come out of this that requires people to implement in a certain way. All that we're going to do in these decisions is inform the use case narrative and the sequence diagrams for the use cases. So we don't want to focus on specific technical parts, but we are going to get a little bit technical just to see if we can get a good solution. So why we're here is that we want to come up with a way for the examples where we can securely share the FHIR patient summaries. And we want to keep the authorization and the privacy and the confidentiality, security and auditing, all those aspects front of mind when we're making our decisions and later on when we're actually implementing. So the reason I've called out those, specific requirements is because in that workshop on the 20th of February, that's what people said that they really wanted agreement on before they could actually implement. So what we need to do is go through some of the options that are available for securely sharing FHIR patient summaries and pick one or pick a couple perhaps for the different use cases that we're going to put in as an example. Again, not going to be mandated. It is purely an example, but it should be technically sound and fit for purpose. There was a page that I sent around a fortnight ago, the Confluence page, which is linked down the bottom if you want to get more details and see some of these options. Hopefully everyone did their homework. So we'll go to the next one, please. So just setting some context and constraints around these decisions. So we've already agreed that there's no central authentication server, that sort of aspect is out of scope. Ideally there would be, but we don't have it. Ruben, yes, I've had very recently had a referral faxed. It shocked me also. Ideally there would be a central authentication server, but we don't have it in scope. So for the purposes of this, we're going to assume that you are sharing the patient summary securely. And if something does come along in the future, then great. Number two is potentially we have an unknown recipient. So the referral is being sent to a specialist. We know their name and where they're at, but it may be triaged by someone else at that practice. Or it could just go to a department at a public hospital. So we can't safely assume that there is a specific person that it's going to. And in the case of a GP visit, the interstate GP visit, that could be any GP. So they're then making the request back to the original GP. Or in the emergency care situation, which is one of the other use cases that we've got in our consideration, that could be anyone accessing the patient summary that's involved in that care situation. And these aspects of not really knowing who the person is, they become really important when we couple that with not having that central authentication server or that identity server. So we really can't be sending around insecure links that anyone could intercept and access.
Sanjeet's hand is raised.
Yep.
Just a question here, Steve.
Yep.
No central authentication server. Assuming sometime in the near future, agency comes out with their solution, would this still hold true?
Yes.
Sure would, because this is an example. It is not. It's not actually the architecture. So it's just an example of what might happen if someone had an authentication server.
Yeah, that's right. And you'll see a bit later on that the options that I'm about to present, they all still work with an authentication server, and they then become even more strongly sort of authenticated and an even better solution really. So yeah, we really want that sort of national infrastructure, but we just got to assume that we don't have it yet. Okay, so the third context or constraint here is that the channels for sending this around are reasonably insecure. So email, fax. I know Ruben has said something about fax, but yes, I've had a referral faxed recently. A printed QR code that someone could snap a picture of. They're all uncontrolled mediums. There is secure messaging, so you might be using that, but in this case, we're just going to assume that it's just being faxed or emailed or printed, and it's reasonably insecure in that regard. So therefore, the actual mechanism of transferring the data needs to be the secure portion. So we've discussed preserving that confidentiality, the integrity, the auditing, and all those things. And so what I've done is I've come up with some options for how we might be able to work these into the examples. There may be more. I'm just going to give a high level of each of these, and then we can pick the ones that we want to use for the examples. Next slide, please. That hasn't changed on my screen. Oh, there we go. Thanks. Okay, so the first one that I want to talk about briefly is public key cryptography. So this is where keys are used to encrypt, essentially encrypt the patient summary. I won't go into the full details of it, but you essentially encrypt the patient summary, and then you send it to the recipient, and only the recipient with a corresponding key can decrypt. This has very strong confidentiality. It works on both embedding the content into the referral itself as a file, but also for sending a link. And it works in both directions. So you can send a link with the encrypted token or the payload. And likewise, you can make a request for a patient summary, send a token, and then the other end can validate and return the patient summary. So that would potentially be the machine-generated option. The cons here is that there is a bit of coordination overhead. So in terms of either pre-sharing these keys or discovering them, somehow figuring out which provider key you need to sign this referral with, potentially mediated through some sort of provider directory or, again, some sort of infrastructure. This we're just going to assume that particular piece has happened so that we have access to the key. Unless people have questions on each of these, I'll just continue on through the next one. So please pop your hands up. The second option is using smart health links. So it's a similar approach where the GP encrypts a patient summary, this time using a random key. And then what happens is that key is then encoded and embedded in the link itself. And so now the recipient can decrypt the, decrypt the link and figure out where the patient summary is and follow that link and get access to it. This is a really great option when we're talking about patient-mediated exchange. So if the patient is providing the link directly to the clinician, that's pretty secure because you're sort of handing the keys over. It works a bit less well when the link is being sent out. So for example, from a GP to another system, or if it's on a printed QR code, because it then becomes pretty uncontrolled. And the reason for this is because the link is constructed so that you just need to base 64 decode it. So base 64 is a reversible encoding. And then you have both the URL to access essentially the patient summary, but also the key to decrypt it. So that is the risk on sending out links with smart health links, is that there is a bearer risk. And if that link falls into the wrong hands, then that person potentially has access to the patient summary. There are a few mitigating factors around adding passcodes and some other options to try to sort of mitigate that. That introduces a bit of extra workflow around if you send the link out, you then need to also essentially phone up the person that you've sent it to and give them the passcode. You have to give that passcode to them through some other method. The other thing with smart health links is if we decided that we wanted to have the referral embedded within, the patient summary embedded within the referral as a file, this option doesn't work because it's all reliant on a link. And the other option is that, the other limitation here is that it only works for sending a patient summary, but not for requesting one on demand. So you can't generate a link yourself and use that to access a patient summary on another system. You need to be sent the link so that then you can access it on that other system. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, option 3. I think we can skip this option. I've listed it here purely for completeness, but it really is a bit of a custom solution, and I feel like we should be leveraging existing protocols and standards for this example. It is an established pattern in terms of things like it's essentially the same process as a single link when you're resetting your password. You get a token that's can only be used once. And the reason that I feel like it potentially doesn't work is that it introduces some fairly significant workflow challenges. So if that link expires, if you click the link, receive the patient summary, but then you want to click it again and it's expired, you then need to go get another link. So I feel like that is probably a bit of a blocker, and we can skip this option unless anyone really likes this option. Otherwise, we can move on. Yeah, no one likes that option. Excellent. All right. So Sanjeed, when a central IDP becomes available, all of those options, they become more strongly access controlled. We now have an identity provider managing authentication and authorization. And it's essentially handling that token issuing. So we have a couple of other options. We have Smart on Fire launches, which are essentially an OAuth 2 identity management, where you get a token, you exchange that token, and then you can access the content. And then we have My Health Record, which could take a copy of the patient summary, or it could have a pointer to the patient summary, and could serve it up that way. So as I said, these options give us some pretty strong identity and access control, but we do need that national infrastructure for them. So I guess there are a couple of options. Does anyone have any questions on any of the options? Because I do have a couple of proposals coming up, just that we can put into the examples based on some of those options.
I'd just like to point out here, we can change our mind. Just because the example shows one, doesn't mean we can't go, yeah, that's not the most interesting one, or something else like that.
Yeah. And also these options really have been tailored. It's not an exhaustive list. So these options have been tailored around the two or three use cases that we're considering. And that is the referral being sent to someone. So that's the point in time. The access by the receiving clinician. So sorry, I think it's the endocrinologist, who then goes back to the original GP and says, "Hey, I want the latest patient summary." And then there's also the interstate GP one, where the patient is sitting next to the clinician, and the GP goes and accesses their patient summary after they get their consent. So there's certainly other options where you need to find a patient summary. So in the case of the emergency situation, you don't know who the original GP is. You've just got to search for patient summaries. So certainly searching and discovering patient summaries is another piece that needs to be considered. But because it's not in our use cases at the moment, I haven't got an option up for that. Okay, so let's move on to a couple of proposals. So in the case of the mechanism where we need to send a patient summary or a link to a patient summary, as we've seen, this is a snapshot, and the patient summary is curated by the usual GP and sent off to a practitioner or a practice. And I would propose that we would use the public key cryptography as the option for that. This allows both options of it being an embedded file, but also an encrypted link. And it gives us a pretty good amount of security for knowing that only the intended recipient or only the intended practice where it is being sent to can open it.
Steve, can you just confirm which consumer journey this is associated with?
The referral to specialist.
Okay.
So sending the referral over to a specialist, yeah.
Oops. No, that's patient summary. Where's the use cases? So that's referral here, part of this journey. So that's referral creation.
Yes. Yep.
Yes, so that's the proposal, we do an example that shows this.
Correct. That's right.
Okay, let's open that up for comment and question. Is that useful to people? Oh, sorry,
just
you
go previous slide. I think you've just moved forward to the next slide. Slide 20, yep.
Yep, I just need to hit that.
Yep, perfect.
So is it useful to people to have this example? Would they prefer a different mechanism in the example? Are they doing something else? Or are we okay with putting this in the example and then reviewing it?
So the other option for this one is you could use a Smart Health link. However, that introduces that risk of it being potentially uncontrolled. And also, if we wanted to actually embed the patient summary, then we don't have that option. So we've got a few different examples that we could put out using this particular method.
Are there any objections to the example use case saying that the mechanism to do this is the public key cryptography?
I don't think I'm qualified to even say yes or no. I don't know.
Noting again, this is what would be a useful example question, not what is the correct answer, assuming there is even a correct answer for a use case in Australia.
Yeah.
I think it's valid. Yeah, that's right. Sure, why not?
Okay, so with no objections noted and no further comments and questions, we will accept that this is what will go in the use case for the purposes of review. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Okay, excellent. All right, so the next one is the other side of the same consumer journey, and this is where the consulting specialist is now wanting to access the patient summary on demand, and this is where they're wanting to get the current one or the most recent one. So this is where the workflow comes back the other way. So the request is, again, from that practitioner back to the original GP, and that is step 4, just there. So they've accessed the patient summary embedded in their referral and confirms the most recent patient summary. So where they're essentially fetching the most recent patient summary, and then they can potentially choose to see both side by side. So in all of the options presented, really the only one that we can use for this, and kind of makes sense if we're already doing an example using public key cryptography for the other direction, is to use that again. So this is where the clinician would generate a token, send it to the original GP. The receiving end will then validate that and then return the patient summary, and that whole workflow is then initiated again to decrypt. So I guess I'd like to propose, unless there's other questions, I'd like to propose that option for the patient summary referral, where they're trying to request the current patient summary.
Are there any, so open to the floor, are there any comments or questions or other suggestions for what should go in the example, or what could go in the example? Hearing none, let's accept that this will go in into the example for the purposes of the review.
Great.
Okay, 5-minute warning and on to the last one.
Okay, third one. So this is for the interstate GP use case, and this is where the patient is in situ with the clinician and they grant access to their patient summary and provide the link. So the use case, describes that very situation. The GP has obtained consent to access the record. Yeah, you can bring it up. That'd be great. Yes, step 4. So during GP consultation, Jeremy provides access to his updated patient summary. So essentially providing consent and, coming directly from the patient. And for this, I feel like the Smart Health Link is a good option here. It's designed specifically for this, where the patient has the keys and controls the access and can consent and give that link or that QR code to the GP for the clinician to click on and get the patient summary.
Are there any comments or questions on that proposal? Okay, so are there any objections to adding into the example that this is a Smart Health Link and then putting that out for review? Okay, so it seems that we have got that.
Excellent, thank you. I will work up those examples and the system diagrams and things like that, and we'll bring that back. Would you like to take it over, Danielle?
Okay, so the next steps for the example use cases are there's one more kind of additional set of example use case design decisions that will come back to the group. We're hoping before it goes out for review, and then it'll come out for review. So they'll have the description and the diagrams and a FHIR example and sequence diagram. Pop that out for review starting in our next meeting. So that's 13th of June. And put that out for 2 weeks with a link off to like a Confluence page to get the feedback so that we can work through refinement of those before we go to ballot for comment. So that's the plan. Okay, let's just skip through. There's a lot of slides there, I think, to the end. What's next? Back to what's next? Okay, so we've gone through this meeting now, which means in our next one, that's going to be all around bundle and composition and how does it work. That's going to be a biggie. It's quite an interesting set of profiles, noting there are no equivalent AU core ones. So we're really going to be walking through how does a bundle profile, the way it's been designed from IPS work, and where we think there's some, I think, real differences that we might need to address. How does it work when we've got those AU patient summary profiles, IPS profiles, AU core profiles? Because remembering our design principles is that we will have a AU patient summary profile where we've got both the core and IPS so that it brings it all together. And where we don't, we're going to say, well, that resource needs to conform to the IPS profile where it exists or the AU core profile where it exists. So what does all that look like and how does it work is what we're going to be walking through. And then we're going to also talk about, I think, any of our testing priorities and things we want to explore so that we go through that testing event and then we'll come back and feed back some of the outcomes for it. We might also have some early use case feedback to be going through and start looking at our AU CDI mapping and finish off any profile walkthroughs we haven't done, which I very much expect that will be AU patient summary encounter and procedure. because I think all of next meeting will really be around composition and bundle. They're really big profiles with quite a lot of detail and I think some gotchas that we need to go through. And then we'll just keep working through material, come to our conformance proposals before we go out to ballot. And that's where we're going to bring in that discussion around what do those must supports actually mean? What are the obligations on people trying to produce this? What are the obligations on people trying to consume it? Which is some of those like display ones that we're concerned about on coding and codable concept IPS. Now, let me advertise here. Our next patient summary conformance session is next Friday. We're going to be talking around the conformance requirements and asking what are our obligations in Australia? Are they different? Are they the same as what is in IPS? And we're also going to start to look at an early proposal for what the conformance should look like in patient summary. So that's next Friday. For those of you who want to join us, we've got those optional conformance sessions. There is then our next actual FHIR IG call, which I just talked about what the agenda was, bundle and composition. Can I check, are there any other topics that people want to put on the agenda for our next meeting, our next in a fortnight? All right. And I've also missed out here that we'll be, I guess, announcing the opening of the example use case review and how to provide feedback on that. So we've actually finished a bit early, which is amazing for us. I'm happy to close that meeting early, or if there's a particular topic that people or question that people want to go through that we didn't get to earlier, I'm happy to go through anything. All right, not seeing any hands up. How about we finish a little bit early today? And I'll see some of you folks in the next conformance session and hopefully most of you in our next FHIR IG call. Thanks, everyone.
You're a legend, Danielle. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.